Now for today's program. Historian, statesman, and Israeli leader Dr. Michael Oren served as Israel's ambassador to the United States, as a member of Knesset, and as Deputy Minister of Diplomacy in the Prime Minister's office. A graduate of Princeton and Columbia, he has taught at Harvard, Yale, and Georgetown. He holds 4 honorary doctorates and was awarded the Statesman of the Year Medal by the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and the Dr. Martin Luther King Legacy Prize. Michael is a New York Times bestselling author and won both the Los Angeles Times and Jewish Book of the Year awards. His latest book, To All Who Call in Truth, was released last month. Formerly the Middle East analyst for CBS and CNN, Michael Oren has also appeared on the Stephen Colbert and Bill Maher shows 60 Minutes and The View. Moving to Israel in 1979, he served as a paratrooper in the IDF and participated in several wars, reaching the rank of major. Michael Oren was named one of the 50 most influential thinkers in America by Politico, one of the 5 most influential Jews in America by The Forward, and one of the 10 most influential Jews worldwide by the Jerusalem Post. Joining Michael today is A.J. Jacobs. A.J. is an author, journalist, lecturer, and human guinea pig. He has written 4 New York Times best-selling books that combine memoir, science, humor, and a dash of self-help. Among his books are The Know-It-All, The Year of Living Biblically, and Thanks 1,000, in which he travels the globe to thank everyone who had even the slightest role in making his morning cup of coffee. He is a contributor to NPR, The New York Times, and Esquire, among others. He has given several TED Talks, including ones about living biblically, creating a one-world family, and living healthily, that have amassed over 10 million views. Please welcome Michael Oren and A.J. Jacobs.
And thank you, Moment Magazine. And thank you, Michael. I am delighted to have the honor to talk to you today. I'm very excited. I'm a fan of your writing and also of your amazing resume, one of the most fascinating resumes ever, that, as Suzanne mentioned, politician, historian, ambassador, Orson Welles cape holder. I just found out greenskeeper at a golf course. So it goes on and on. I want to spend half an hour talking to you about writing and about To All Who Call in Truth, your wonderful new novel. And then we're going to open it up to questions, and people can ask you about anything they want, writing or Israel or the newly appointed ambassador. President Biden just appointed a new ambassador to Israel. So if people want to discuss that, but I want to focus on the writing as a writer. So I love this book. Congratulations. Tell me how it came about. What was the inspiration and what's it all about?
Well, first of all, shalom, everybody. Shalom to all our friends at Moment Magazine. Thank you for hosting us so warmly. Thank you, AJ. I've read all your books. I've been trying to live biblically ever since then. I've tried to thank people for being nice and making my coffee. I've tried to read the Encyclopedia Britannica. None of it works. I don't know how you did any of this stuff. Okay, and so it's terrific. You are my hero. And thank you. And I add just one little small thing to that resume, which is actually the most important thing. I'm a father and very proud grandfather. I told remember 5.5 grandchildren I have. The half is not because of some Solomonic arrangement I have with another family. Coming up.
Mazel tov.
All beautiful. Okay, this book, To All Who Call in Truth, is my 4th work of fiction. People say, when did you start writing fiction? When did you leave history? When did you read diplomacy? It's just the other way around. I started off as a writer. I'm talking to you from the house in which I grew up in, West Orange, New Jersey. We're here for my mother's 93rd birthday. All my family is gathering. You'll probably hear them traipsing in behind me momentarily. It was in this house many, many years ago. I was 12 years old, where I came home with a very funny feeling, not the funny feeling you expect from a 12-year-old boy. I sat down and wrote a poem, AJ. It was called Who Cries for the Soul of the Pigeon? An adolescent angst poem. And I came home every day after that, wrote a whole book of poetry. Then one day I got on a bus at 13 years old, went into New York City from here, walked into Alfred A. Knopf and delivered my book. Here's my book. You have to publish my book. 2 days later, they rejected it. And I went up to my room and cried. I cry after every rejection. It doesn't, it never gets better. It never gets easier. It's a rejection. Nah, it doesn't work like that. I actually saved them. I'm that masochistic. I saved them in a file, which if you remember what the Manhattan phone book looked like, that's what all rejections look like. But I kept writing. I kept writing poetry, short stories. I was always experimenting. I wrote a film when I was 17 that I made into a very short clip that won the #1 prize on the PBS Young Filmmakers program, on Channel 13, and those of you on the East Coast, and that meant that I had to go to Hollywood. That's the Orson Welles part, and that was actually worse than some of the wars I've been in. Working with Orson Welles, not a nice guy, very large man, and I thought I would go on to a life in writing, and but I also had this other obsession, if you would. I had to live in the state of Israel. I had vowed when I was 15 years old, when I met Israel's ambassador to the United States, that I would be that someday. I was going to be Israel's ambassador to the United States. The guy's name was Yitzhak Rabin, and I ended up working for him. I was an advisor until his assassination, and then took me on a different course of studying Middle Eastern history, writing history books, being in government in various positions, elected and unelected, and appearing in front of the media. So that's the whole capsule of the story. But I never stopped writing. And I published my first novel in 2000. It was it is the best trilogy of novellas about the Negev Desert ever written. You know what? The only one. It's called Sand Devil. I loved it. Another novel came out a couple of years later called Reunion, about my father's World War II experiences based on it. And then a long hiatus, because in Israel, as in the United States, if you are in public office, you can't publish. You can write, but you can't publish, right? And so I wrote and didn't publish, didn't perish, but didn't publish. And then when I came out of government 2 years ago, began to publish again. And then when Corona hit, I began to write fiercely again. And I have, this book is the product of that. And I'll talk about my next book if you like too, but this one just came out last month, Raw, Coal, and Truth. It's set in a small suburban community, surprisingly just like the one from which I'm talking to you, that in the year 1972. And I chose that year not only because it was formative for me, but because the early 70s for me evoke a lot of the present circumstances. If you were to talk to a young person in the early 70s about the future of the United States, they'd be very pessimistic, because the campuses were on fire, the post office were blowing up, there was Watergate, the country looked very, very bleak. And the book also takes place in the Jewish community, part of a Jewish community around a synagogue. It's the Judaism, conservative Judaism of the 1970s, which was very vapid spiritually, but which was populated by some very towering figures. And there are cameo appearances by Elie Wiesel in this book, by Shlomo Kalibach, even by Meir Kahane. And these are the figures we used to have back then. It was the last moment in American Jewish history when Jews were an ethnicity. You're young, I don't know if you can follow this, but back then only Jews ate bagels.
That is amazing. Yeah.
They weren't everything bagels. They were hard. Bagels.
No blueberry bagels.
No blueberry bagels. We were immensely proud of Sandy Koufax and Alan Sherman. We were an ethnicity. If you gave me a questionnaire, if you asked, if I was Asian, white, or black, or other, I'd fill in other. We weren't white. I played sports in college, and someone had written on the wall, "Are Jews white?" And underneath, someone had written, "Yes, but." Okay.
Interesting. Wow.
We were the yes, but back then. Today, it's like yes, emphatically. But we were
right.
So we had a completely different identity. And I grew up in this town, which back then was half Jewish and half Italian. And there were a couple of WASPs in town, and we felt bad for them because we didn't know what they were. What's your identity? So the book goes back to there. It's a book about a junior high school guidance counselor who's also a sports coach. It's about adolescence, but it's really about betrayal, lust, passion, and ultimately it's about murder.
Yeah, I loved it. It was unputdownable, as they say. It kept propelling me through. Yeah, there's a lot for me to dig into there. First of all, my wife also grew up in a Jewish Italian town, and they called it matzah pizza.
Matzah pizza. That's
so you
great.
knew about
Yeah. Oh, sure. Everyone knew matzah pizza.
And secondly, I just want to say I'm in awe of your prolificness, because you have come, I'm a full-time writer. Like, that's my only job. You have about 8 jobs. Wow. And somehow you come out with a book every, more often than I brush my teeth. So I don't know how you do that. So tell me about how do you do it? How are you so productive?
Well, one part of it is I'm very disciplined. I just am. I structure my day in such a way that I'm writing, that I get, I'm still, I'm an oarsman. So I row in my boat, my scull, and I play some musical instruments, and I make sure that it's structured in that way. And then also, I work. I got to make a living. So I make a living in consulting. I actually, as soon as I get off this podcast, I got a consulting meeting. Go figure. And and all of it's very interesting. And then there's politics and being in the media and talking about politics, which I do a lot. I was on I think TV twice today. Talking about the Israeli government. So, if you're ADHD, this is the life for you. If you don't want a linear life, this is the life for you. I can't function any other way. The creative writing experience is fundamentally, I would say, spiritually different than anything else.
How so?
Well, for one thing, I don't go to the stories, they come to me. A story will present itself, whether it's a short story. I mean, I got to plug my own books now. So earlier in the year, I published The Night Archer, which is 50.
I love that book too.
And you're good enough to blurb. Thank you. You're on the phone.
Oh, my pleasure.
You're right. I mean, there.
That was so creative, because the topics that you covered in those short stories, everything from aliens on down. It was a remarkable feat of imagination. But please continue. The stories don't come to you.
Whether it's a short story or a novel or anything else, it could be a play, it could be a screenplay, they come to me. It's like knocking on the door. Hello. Oh, there you are. You're the story I'm supposed to write.
Is it in the shower? Is it while walking? How does it work?
It could be anywhere. Really, it could be anywhere. And it happens like this. It happens in a fraction of a second. And my first reaction almost invariably is, nah, I can't do that. That's too wacko. That's too weird. Or that's beyond my capabilities. I can't do it. I do have a novel coming out next year. It's called Fourth Cliff, which is set on an imaginary island off the coast of Massachusetts in 1944, 1945. And on this island, there are a couple of, all the men have been taken off to war. Most of the women have gone off to war production factories. And left on the island are a lot of old and very strange people, and 90 Italian prisoners of war, and a policewoman, Mary Beth Swan, whose husband's off with the Marines in the Pacific. So she's become basically the police captain of the island. And Mary Beth Swan has a problem. Not only is she viewed as a foreigner by people on the island, she's one after another, the Italians are being murdered by a serial killer. Now, ask me where this came from. Hello? 1944, 45, Nantucket, something like this, Italian prisoners of war. I have no idea. It is, but I must say, it is a beautiful process. It is like nothing I know. I mean,
you had said it was meditative at one point.
It's spirituality, and when I finish writing, I have no memory of writing. It's almost like being in a trance. And I'm a believing person, so I say a little prayer afterwards. I say, thank you for the gift of creativity. I'm very grateful for it, even though I get the file that's as thick as the Manhattan phone book of rejections, and I get them still. Certainly in the world of op-ed writing, you get rejections all the time.
Right. And, well, that's what I always tell my kids. Failure and rejection, so important, and just push on through. And I actually love the phrase strategic chutzpah. That's what I tell my kids to have, chutzpah. And you, with your, as a teenager, knocking on the door of Knopf, you had some excellent strategic chutzpah.
It's funny, in the rejection note, in the rejection letter was a personal note, handwritten note from an editor named Ashbel Green. Do you remember? He was one of the towering editors of New York. And he said to me, we can't publish this, but keep going. don't stop. And I kept up with him over the years. I was in Knesset and getting notes from him. And every time I got a book, I sent him, I sent him the reviews. I sent him this. He'd write me back. I'm so proud of you. It was a beautiful story. He's passed away, but Ash Green, was an influence. He just was.
Mm. Love it. Now, we were talking earlier about inspiration, and first of all, I'm very jealous that these stories come to you. It doesn't work that way for me, and I and I don't find it meditative. I find it like, pulling teeth. But so I'm very jealous. But you talked about how it's almost like alphabet soup, I think was the phrase you used, and you'll have all of these experiences, and they'll just pop out onto the page, whether it's your uncle's table or a Japanese sword that's hanging. So tell me about the alphabet soup a little.
I don't necessarily where they come from. Here's a story from The Night Archer, a story that a lot of people like, called The Old Asaphagus. And it's about a homeless woman and her daughter who travel around in a car, and they go from town to town, job to job. And life for the mother is brutally hard. She's had it rough. She's had it rough, but she's a wonderful mother, and she's a hero. She's a great hero. And she wants to shield her daughter from the outside, from the harshness of the world, from the brutality and the cruelty. But every once in a while, something happens, and she'll say, what can I do? It's the Old Asaphagus. It's the Old Asaphagus. Now, I had no idea where Old Asaphagus came from. It basically means the bum rap. That's the way of the world. And my father passed away several months ago, and we were cleaning out the attic, and we came across a trunk. And in the trunk was items belonging to his older brother, who had died in 1960, had been a surgeon. And there was a laminated plaque in there to the fellows of the Old Asaphagus. And the Old Asaphagus turns out was a sort of secret comedy and drinking society of surgeons. There was the Fraternal Order of the Old Asaphagus. And I think I remembered from when I was 5 years old that whenever something went wrong, my uncle would say, oh, it's the Old Asaphagus. No, scoot ahead 50 years later, and that becomes the name of the story, and it becomes the word that this woman this homeless woman in a car uses to describe the brutality of the world, and the way that sort of to shove it off too. It's the Old Asaphagus. How did that happen? That's alphabet soup. There was a letter O that came to the surface there, and I scooped it up. But every story and every novel is like that. It's filled with dozens and dozens of these very random memories that somehow congeal and make sense.
Right. I love that. Yeah. And you had also said at one point when we were talking how characters just appear to you and you don't know where they're going. That sometimes they'll appear in the beginning of the book and you don't know till the end why they showed up.
It's something I've learned the hard way over the years. In this book, in the new book about Fourth Cliff, about the island. The island's full of some very strange people, and were left over. They weren't drafted, and they work in diners. They work on fishing trawlers. Sometimes they'll appear at the beginning of the book, and they'll just have they'll have a cameo role, a walk-on role, you say, and they'll maybe not even say anything. They'll just be noted in the crowd. And lo and behold, 80 pages later, they show up again. And turns out they actually have a pivotal role in the book, an essential role in the book. Now, I didn't know this when I started writing the book. By the way, it's a whodunit, and I didn't know who did it. I didn't know who did it.
That is fascinating. See, I don't work that way.
Maybe even to all call the truth, it's a murder. I didn't know who did the murder till close to the end of the book.
Fascinating.
And what I've learned the hard way is trust your characters. They have appeared to you for a reason. Give it time, give it birth, and they will reveal themselves to you. And, damn AJ, they always do. They just always do. It's a little bit of Star Wars-y thing, It's like the Force will be with you. Just let them be. So interesting.
Right, fascinating. Before I open it up to questions, because I know people have tons, I just want to ask a couple of specifics about this book, your latest. First of all, I noticed that there was a cameo from by the Israeli ambassador to the United States. So was that based on anyone in particular?
Well, what happens when he's there? A short, fat kid comes up and shakes his hand. Okay, that's me.
So did you meet the Israeli ambassador to the U.S. when you were?
Well, yeah, I said before, when I was 15, I went to Washington with my Jewish youth group, and I met the ambassador, Yitzhak Rabin, and I shook his hand. And that moment, I made a vow. I said, that's what I want to be when I grow up. I want to be Israel's ambassador to the United States. And I took it very seriously. My entire academic professional career was geared toward realizing that dream.
Fascinating.
It happened.
Yeah, Mazel tov. I also, there's a part in the book which overlaps with the Munich Olympics. And so I wanted to ask, what were your memories of that? And also Mark Spitz, who I had forgotten was Jewish, but he was
how could you forget that? That was like the biggest thing in our life. Mark Spitz is Jewish with the great Jewish chest with the gold medals.
He did a very hairy Jewish chest. That's right.
And Derry, the Jewish mustache and the whole thing. I think he later, I'm not sure. I think he converted. I'm not sure. But no, the Munich massacre was profoundly shocking and traumatic for us. Keep in mind, it was, this wasn't all that long after the Holocaust. And we're dealing with a generation, certainly of my parents who had lived through World War II, many Holocaust survivors in our community. And that the hardest thing was the way the German government treated it. Like, the show must go on, too bad. I think everybody in the Jewish community wanted the Olympics to be halted. They didn't. It was clear that the German government had fouled up royally, insensitively. And it was very, very difficult for us, the Munich massacre. And I think it still is for people of my generation.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there was another incident in the book where there was anti-Semitic graffiti in the school. So what was your, as a child, were you exposed to a lot of anti-Semitism? Was there anti-Semitic graffiti in your life?
So I grew up in this neighborhood. This is a working class neighborhood. I was the only Jewish kid on the block. I think my mother's still the only Jewish kid on the block. And I experienced anti-Semitism more or less daily in various forms. And then I experienced it after that, being in sports, being in public life, certainly being an Israeli, I experienced it. And I was afraid when writing this book, when I started it, that American Jews wouldn't understand it, because I met many American Jews who never encountered anti-Semitism. And as events unfolded in recent years, I think you can say safely today that no American Jew would not understand a book that has a lot of anti-Semitism in it. Unfortunately, it's tremendous anti-Semitism here, and everybody feels it. And so, anti-Semitism plays a big role here. And it was the fear that American Jews reading this book would say, nah, that didn't happen like that. I think that's changed.
Yeah. Do you think the level of anti-Semitism, even though it has risen in the last few years, do you think it's lower than it was when you were a kid, or do you think
it's higher? I think it's higher.
Really?
Yeah, I think it's higher not because numerically higher. People are in the business of counting anti-Semitic incidents, which I think is probably a bad metric. How do you count an attitude? But American Jews have a problem that European Jews don't have, even British Jews don't have, and that is American Jews can't define anti-Semitism. And it's very difficult to fight against something you can't define. Like the New York Times comes out the other day with this front page article about showing all the pictures of the Palestinian kids who have been killed in the recent fighting in Gaza. Now, to people like me, that's blatantly anti-Semitic. That's singling Israel out. That's evoking the blood libels of the Middle Ages. American forces killed 250,000 civilians in Iraq and Afghanistan. You never saw a page like that. So by the EU definition, by the UN definition, that's anti-Semitic. But American Jews can't agree whether that page is anti-Semitic or not. And some American Jews would say, good, we should have pictures like that. So it's very difficult to define and fight. So numerically, I think it's much more difficult today because anti-Semitism has seeped into the mainstream in the way it is. And then it was considered, I don't know, déclassé, not done. I'm of the generation that was on the cusp of the quota system. In the universities, your university, my university, and they were just lifting those quotas because they realized that they were unseemly. They're indefensible. Today, we see instances of anti-Semitism moving into the mass media, even moving on to late-night comedy shows, in ways that, doesn't seem to bother, people who aren't very sensitive to this. Today we have anti-Semitism much more of the left as well as the right. So if we're getting it from all over, you have, intersectionality, where I was just reading this morning that by an incident at Stanford University, a big debate whether anti-Semitism is racism or not, because racism is about power and affluence, and Jews are powerful and affluent, so hating them can't be as bad as hating people of color. That is not a debate that took place when I grew up. We all understood that anti-Semitism was the same thing as racism against blacks, against Spanish people. It was exactly the same. And that also enabled us to make common cause with them, the Jews involved in the civil rights movement, because we knew it. My father, Oliver Shalom, was dedicated his life to this. He ran a Jewish hospital, Beth Israel, in Newark, New Jersey, in the middle of one of the biggest black ghettos here. And after the '67 riots, when all the quote unquote white hospitals left Newark, he insisted that the Jewish hospital remain in Newark and serve that community. The Jewish hospitals were also the first hospitals to hire black doctors, for the reason that they knew, that the Jewish doctors knew what it like not to be able to get a job. That's why they created Jewish hospitals. They were the Brandeis of Jewish hospitals. They were created to give Jewish doctors a job. So we knew what it was like. We had our intersectionality back then. It's gotten much, much more difficult today, I think.
Interesting. Well, this seems like a perfect segue to open it up to questions from the audience, who, as I encourage you to ask about Michael's writing and his many books, but of course he's also touched on some on Israel and Judaism, which I'm sure is of interest to many of you as well. So, Suzanne, did you want to read the Q's and Michael can do the A's, or did you want me to be involved?
So first of all, thank you both for that. Mike, before we begin, which we'll start with a few questions about your writing in your book, Peter Kessel wanted me to mention that your father was also a World War II hero.
He was indeed a World War II, and I mentioned also that my second book, Reunion, incorporates many of his war stories.
Great. So the first question is, where does the title of your book come from, and why did you name it this?
So for many years, as a very bored Hebrew school student, and I was always getting kicked out of class, they made me sit in the sanctuary. And P.S. I never learned Hebrew then. I read my bar mitzvah in transliteration. That was the vapid world of American Judaism in the early '70s. It's gotten much, much, much more interesting and deeper in terms of the spirituality. And I would stare at a wall in the sanctuary, and hanging on the wall were these gold painted letters with a quote from Psalm 145. The Lord is near to all who call upon him, to all who call upon him in truth. And if you're praying 3 times a day, you're saying that 4 times a day. It's part of the Ashrei prayer. And to my mind, looking back on that quote, it is the ultimate statement of Jewish faith. I mean, think about it. This is a line that was written 3,000 years ago. And the psalmist is saying that the Lord will be near to you if you come to the Lord in truth. What an amazing concept. Both the proximity of God as well as the way to approach God. Okay, with truth, not necessarily with sacrifices, not necessarily with wars and or fires, but with truth. And I've dwelt on that line for many, many years. And in this book, which is about truth, it's also about untruth. It's about lies. I think that quote was a very fitting quote. And P.S. it appears on the wall of the sanctuary in the synagogue to which my protagonist, Sandy Cooper, belongs.
Thank you. And Debbie Schubach would like to know, does your book contain the story about when your shul, the Jewish Center B'nai Shalom, was blown up before Meir Kahane would speak? Spoiler alert. Okay.
I plead the 6th, which is spoiler alert.
Fair enough. So in terms of The Night Archer and To All Who Call in Truth, I've put a link in the chat for people if they'd like to purchase the book, and we will be sending up a follow-up email in a few days, and I'll have the links in there so you can find out what happened in both the short stories and the murder mystery and To Who All to all who call in truth. All right, so we have lots and lots of questions with regards to Israel. We're wondering if you could first give a brief overview of how this coalition government is supposed to work with the sharing of power between Naftali Bennett, who's on the right, and Yair Lapid, a centrist, and what are some of the other parties that make up the coalition?
There are 8 parties in this coalition. It's on a rotational prime ministerial basis. Naftali Bennett will be prime minister for 2 years. After that, Yair Lapid, the centrist, will take over. 8 other parties include, on the left, Meretz and Labor. On the right, the Gideon Saar's party, as well as Naftali Bennett's party, and also Blue and White Party of Benny Gantz, the former chief of staff of the army. My former military attaché in Washington, I know Benny quite well. Basically, Israeli politics is small. You know all of them quite well. It is the most diverse coalition we've had. We've had right-left coalitions before, but this is the most diverse. Because the key to the whole thing is an Islamic purist party called Ram, led by a rather, I think, intrepid individual, Mansour Abbas. So this is the first coalition where an Arab party is not just a member, but a key member. It's a decisive member. It also contains the largest number of women ever ministers in Israeli history, 10 women ministers. It contains an Arab minister, my dear friend Asawi Frege. I'm delighted for him. So just fascinating. It's fascinating. Will it hold? Well, majority of Israelis think not. And the reason is the opposition, now led by the Likud, will table legislation this week designed to break it apart. For example, if they table legislation that calls for annexing part of the West Bank, well, Yair Lapid's, Naftali Bennett's party will have to vote for that, as will Gideon Saar's party will have to vote for that, but everyone else will oppose it. Conversely, if the Likud were to put a table of motion about civil marriage, we don't have civil marriage in Israel. Well, certainly Labor and Meretz are going to vote for that. Blue and White will vote for it. Probably Yair Lapid will vote for it, but Bennett and Mansour Abbas will vote against it. The Arabs will vote against it because they're Islamic purists. So it's going to be very, very bumpy. Hamas could also break it apart if they start firing rockets again. Ram, the Islamic purist party, will not go along with a harsh Israeli military response against Gaza. They just won't, and part of Meretz won't either. So my own feeling is if the government can survive 1 week, it'll survive probably a month. If it survives a month, it's liable to survive 6 months. If it survives 6 months, it's likely to survive its whole term, certainly to the rotation of Yair Lapid.
Thank you. And how is Bennett regarded in the foreign policy arena?
I think those are the insider track. The Beltway, they know who Bennett is. They know that he represents a right-wing party, that party is opposed to the two-state solution. That party is certainly opposed to the Iranian nuclear deal of 2015, but then again, so are most Israeli parties. And I think what you're going to see is maybe not so much a change of substance, but you're still going to see a change of tone. Now, I worked with Benjamin Netanyahu for many years. His tone was to make things very public, whether his famous squabbles with President Obama, now his attacks even on the Biden administration on the question of Iranian nuclearization, all very, very public. Netanyahu was a man of the media, very much so. Naftali Bennett is not. And so I think you're going to see things a lot more sort of sub rosa than you saw in the past. And that, I can tell you as a diplomat, that creates space. When things aren't public, you have space. I said frequently during the recent Gaza fighting, I was on the news a lot, and I said if I were back in university teaching diplomacy, I would give President Biden an A+. Because what they did, in contrast to previous administrations, was rather than coming out and criticizing Israel publicly and creating a situation where the Israeli government had to force back and not be seen as giving in to the United States, the president kept on coming out again and again and again and saying, I uphold Israel's right to defend itself. That created it created a tremendous amount of military maneuverability in space, and also gave the president leverage. So when the president came to Netanyahu, and I remember the moment very well because I was sort of there, and said, okay, enough, you're stopping. Netanyahu had really no choice. Nobody wanted to stop, by the way. 80% of the Israelis were against a ceasefire, including my own left-wing kids. But Netanyahu had no choice because Biden had navigated that diplomacy so deftly. I was very impressed.
Mhm. Thank you. And to continue on that, how do you view President Biden on the international stage, both his track record and his potential? And is your view common to the Israelis you speak with?
Well, I know Joe Biden very well. And, I'm just sort of not self-aggrandizing here. When I was ambassador, we were going through successive crises. The State Department under Hillary Clinton, certainly Hillary Clinton herself, the Secretary of State, boycotted the Israeli embassy, wouldn't take my calls. But Joe Biden was always available. And so I ended up logging a lot of time with him. And I know him to be a very honest man, a person who's deeply committed to Israel, deeply committed to the alliance between Israel and the United States. We have policy differences. We do, particularly over the Iranian issue. We have a deep policy issue. But it's sort of fundamentally different than what we experienced during the Obama years. It's certainly different than we experienced during the Trump years. And it has to be judged on its own merits. My sense is, and here I'm going to say something tough, so brace yourself. Yes, President Biden has brought a new voice, or rather restored an old voice to America's interactions with the world. He's set to meet with Putin. I was just on Israeli television talking about that. But there's on one point in which President Obama, President Trump, and President Biden are exactly identical. They hate hearing this, but it's true. And that's on the level of isolationism. America is withdrawing from the world. It's withdrawing militarily from the world. It is probably not in a position to project major military power elsewhere in the world. And it's human nature. It's certainly the nature of diplomacy that when two foreign leaders meet one another, if one is projecting power in the world, whether it be in Crimea or the Ukraine or the Middle East, he's going to have an advantage to the statesman whose country is pulling back.
Thank you.
How about that? That was tough, huh?
And then right before we came on, as AJ had mentioned, the new ambassador to Israel from the United States was selected, Thomas Nides. What are your feelings on him as being the next ambassador?
First of all, I'm impressed that you got the name right. I'll take no credit for that because his name is spelled Nides. Everyone said it says Nides, and they can't get it right. It's Nides. Tom Nides is a great choice. He's a personal friend of mine. I think the world of him. I was just texting back and forth with him, and I just couldn't make a better choice. He comes out of two backgrounds. He's a banker. He's from J.P. Morgan, but he's also was the undersecretary during Hillary's period, and I had a tremendous amount of interaction with him. He's a person who's deeply committed, like the Biden administration, like Tony Blinken, deeply committed to Israel's security and our alliance. Yes, we'll have policy differences. I have to say that all the time. But I'm delighted he's coming. I'm really looking forward to this.
Great. How much power does Bibi still wield as head of the opposition, and what's next for him?
We don't know. And the long knives are out. I'm already getting text messages from various senior Likudniks who are vying to oust him. I mean, I don't want to, it's probably a bad metaphor, but the body's not cold yet, and they're already dicing it up. And so he's going to have an even harder fight on his hands, remaining the head of the opposition. I think, it's the role of the opposition to try to take down the government. It depends how. And I think that some of the things that Netanyahu said the other day on the first day of the government, sort of comparing it to, saying it's a disaster and they're celebrating in Tehran. I think that type of talk is deeply harmful to the Israeli political system. I think it's deeply harmful to our interests abroad, to our image, and I think it shouldn't be allowed.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Will the Abraham Accords be impacted by last month's war with Hamas and the new Israeli government? And is there any hope for new countries to formalize relationships?
The answer is no. It won't be impacted by the war. It was impacted by the protests around Jerusalem, because these are Muslim countries and they were very sensitive. But once Hamas started firing rockets at Tel Aviv, it ended. They're not on board on that. Okay, and we have normalized relationship with these countries. Whether additional countries would join, all I can say is I hope so. It is in the nature of any new administration not to invest in the achievements of the previous administration. Certainly, if the previous administration was headed by Mr. Trump. So I don't know how much the Biden administration is going to invest. One thing I do know, and this I know, categorically, that if the United States does renew the Iran nuclear deal, other states will seek to join the Abraham Accords, because Israel is going to be the only country in the world that can stand up both to Iran as well as Turkey. Turkey also threatens these countries. They back Islamic extremists. And so we've gone from being an enemy to being the ultimate ally of these countries. And they know it.
Is it true that Hamas sent incendiary balloons into Israel today? If Hamas fires rockets into Israel tomorrow as a response to the flag parade, who decides on the level of retaliation? And can the retaliation cause a problem for the coalition?
Good question. It's important to note that the United States, that Israel, unlike the United States, does not have a commander-in-chief at its head. The Prime Minister of Israel is not the commander-in-chief. The commander-in-chief is the Israeli security cabinet. That's sort of a kitchen cabinet made up of security people, ministers. Broadly, the cabinet itself has to decide on war. The Prime Minister has a certain amount of leeway in returning fire because he just can't be in the cabinet all the time. And yes, it will impact the coalition. As I mentioned earlier, if the fighting begins to sort of snowball, then the Ram faction will have a hard time remaining in the coalition.
Thank you. Down the line, in future American presidential cycles, do you think that the United States could ever have a president who does not support Israel?
Eventually, I can't. Here I'll take the seventh. Okay, we've been through the fifth, the sixth, and we're up to the seventh. The seventh is I'm an historian. I have enough problems predicting the past. All right, and there are certainly currents and processes that are going through America right now and transforming American politics, of which Israel has no control. We didn't invent wokeism. We didn't invent cancel culture. We didn't invent, I don't know, intersectionality. We didn't invent it. And I think that even if Israel created a two-state solution tomorrow, I don't think it would materially impact those processes. So I don't know where they play out in terms of American politics, whether there's a sort of a reformation or a reconquista against all this, a backlash against cancel culture. Certainly the Republicans would like to have that type of backlash. I don't know, but someone like Bernie Sanders came close. He was within a certain shooting range. Elizabeth Warren within shooting range, and they now have come out and had a very different position about America's relationship with Israel.
Mm-hmm. And does it matter that more American Jews in the United States are less supportive of Israel and her policies than in the past?
It matters. Of course it matters. And there are debates about the actual numbers. It's certainly clear among young liberal American Jews, an alienation and disaffection. Israel has to do a better job of reaching out to them. But keep in mind, we can only reach out to a degree. We can't adopt policies that in order to say, to satisfy the demands of these young liberal American Jews, policies that will endanger our children and grandchildren. No one's going to do that. No one's going to say that the Iran nuclear deal is a good deal. Nobody. Mm-hmm. Even though the majority of American Jews support it.
Right. Why does it seem the majority of Palestinians support Hamas and not the Palestinian Authority? And did this last round of fighting weaken the PA even more?
It does. And I, for a year and a half, I was in charge of Gaza from the Israeli government. I don't wish to this on anybody, okay? And what I learned was that everything I know about, human governance, everything I know about humanity, you can pretty much throw out the window when you're talking about Hamas and Gaza. You have a terrorist group that keeps its population in a humanitarian disaster status in order to play victim to the world, in order to keep that population weak. You have a Palestinian Authority that's willing to fight Hamas to the last Israeli. You have Iran that's willing to fight Israel to the last Palestinian. It's a madhouse. This is Hamas that uses thousands of children to dig its tunnels. You have 100 kilometers of tunnels. Who dug them? I wonder. It's Palestinian kids that are basically enslaved, and hundreds of them die. So you got to throw out everything about the way human beings interact. And one of the things you have to throw out is that Hamas can starve its population. It can deprive them of all but 3 hours of electricity a day. It can deprive them of all but 4% of potable water, and it will win overwhelmingly in any election. And not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank, which is why the Palestinian Authority hasn't had elections. This is why Mahmoud Abbas, the president, is entering the 16th year of his 4-year term. Now, why that is, it's because Hamas represents values. It represents Islam, and they take it very seriously. Hamas represents resistance to Israel. Hamas is largely incorruptible, whereas the PA is thoroughly corrupt. The Palestinian Authority has received hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of millions of dollars in foreign aid over the course of the last 25 years. And where is the aid? It's sitting in bank accounts in Paris, Suha Arafat and all that. Palestinians aren't stupid. They know this. They know these people are completely corrupt. And so that's why.
Mm-hmm. And how concerned does Israel need to be about Lebanon and Hezbollah?
Very concerned, especially if the Iran nuclear deal is signed. Hezbollah currently has 130,000 rockets aimed at us. Many are very accurate rockets, unlike the rockets from Gaza. They are hidden under 200 Lebanese villages, under houses. And should they shoot those rockets at us, our army will have to go into those villages house to house. That's what we train today. Our army trains to do that. And why would Hezbollah shoot at us? Well, here's the scenario. Under the JCPOA, the restrictions on Iran's nuclear program begin to lift with the sunset clauses starting in 2023. Eventually, Iran will move to get a nuclear weapon, and Israel will not let that happen. We will move. But in the interim, Iran will have received hundreds of billions of dollars in sanction relief and business deals, which they will not spend on schools and hospitals. Surprise, surprise. They will spend it on rockets and missiles to give to Hamas, to give it to Shiite militias in Iraq and in Syria, to Yemen, to the Houthis in Yemen. And when we try to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, we are going to get hit. And we're going to get hit like we've never seen before. It's going to make what happened a couple of weeks ago look like a very small picnic. And of this, I'm absolutely certain. And we have to prepare for that in every possible way. Mm-hmm. We've really brought this conversation down, haven't we? We were talking about immigration, we're talking about spirituality, now we're talking about war and nuclearization.
We'll turn it around in a minute.
We become a little bit more, elevated here.
Turn it around in a minute. But
we're all going to go off and drink after this. I mean, really.
What has been learned from this later war with Hamas? And is there a possible solution to the Palestinian-Israel political situation?
They're two very, very different questions. It's like, how do you mow the lawn and whether you bring your lunch? And so what have we learned? We learned that, I've learned, I know what we've learned, I know what I've learned, that with every passing war, now we've had 4, and I participated in them both as a statesman, a commentator, and as a soldier, right? Our position worsens. Our response gets more and more accurate, but the international response becomes less and less sensitive to Israel's needs and more critical of Israel's actions. The wars have actually gotten shorter. In 2008, the war was 3 weeks long. In 2014, it was 26 days long. We've killed fewer Palestinians. We've been great. We've been more condemned by the world, and the Palestinian rocket fire has intensified, and the range has increased. So are we winning or are we losing? I would say that Hamas has won. Hamas has won a very big victory. Yes, we may have deterred it for a while and knocked down a lot of its underground tunnels, but we paid a huge price. So the next war, what I've learned, is going to be shorter, costlier in terms of our diplomacy, more damaging in terms of what Hamas could do to us in terms of its rockets. Israel has to make a decision what it wants to do about Gaza, because the current policy, I think, is in the long run untenable. So that's what I've learned. Is there a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian problem? Listen, I have an interesting perspective because, as you mentioned, as I mentioned, I worked with Yitzhak Rabin. I have accompanied this process from day one. I've been involved in many peace plans, including the Trump peace plan. And I will say at the end of it, and I say this as also a person who has, I'm involved in politics, still have political aspirations. I'm in favor of a two-state solution in theory. And I stress in theory because I can't think of any way in hell it's ever going to happen. And the Palestinians clearly don't want it. They've rejected it again and again since the 1930s. Right now, they actually don't have a government that's capable of signing on that agreement. Israelis will never let the Palestinians have control, security control over the West Bank. We will not, outsource our security to the Palestinians. It ain't going to happen. I can't think of any situation, and I would like to think of alternatives to it. So a solution in the American sense of solution, the answer is categorically no. A solution in the Middle Eastern sense, which is much more amorphous and implicit. It's not, it's not what I call a Westphalian solution where two sides sit down and sign a piece of paper and draw a line. It's not going to happen. What will happen is something that is much more implicit. I'll conclude with this. Much of the talk about, one state, two state is moot, because if you drive up Israel's Highway 6, which follows the old 1967 border, to your right, to the east, you're going to see a Palestinian flag. There actually is a Palestinian state. It has, has some kind of borders, it has some kind of government, it has a police force, it has a flag, it could have elections if it wanted to. And the issue then is, okay, how do we take this two-state reality and make it stronger and expand it? That is the issue. And that will require, strong leadership on all sides. Israel, thank God, has one right now. Palestinians do not have one.
Is the paratrooper unit considered an elite force of the IDF? And why was that your choice for joining?
Oh, because I grew up in the 1960s, and pictures of the paratroopers at the Western Wall, with the talus made of bullets. You had to be a paratrooper, and all the songs were about paratroopers. I went into the Israeli army as a lone soldier at the time where they didn't know very much about what a lone soldier was. I said, I'm going to the paratroopers. They said, no, you're going to artillery. And I said, no, I'm going to paratroopers. And they said, you're going to jail. So they put me in like in the brig in a tent for a couple of weeks. And every time they say to me, are you ready to go to the artillery? I said, no, I'm going to paratroopers. And they said, you're staying in jail. And I think I was in there for 3 weeks, and they finally said, oh, go to the paratroopers, see what we care. And I went to the paratroopers, and I had a tryout. And keep in mind, I had come to the Israeli army as a gold medal winning athlete from the Maccabi games. I won the marathon. I was in really great shape. The tryouts put me in a hospital for a week. Wasted me. And there were 18 months of basic training to go after that. You gotta be nuts to do this stuff. And it's amazing I'm walking at this point. And I spent altogether 35 years in the military, both as an active soldier, an officer, and a reservist. And trust me, if they asked me tomorrow, I'd go back. I kind of love the army. The Israeli army is totally different than the American army. My father here, as mentioned, was a war hero. He was for a while a career officer. The American army is completely different. Everything you know about an army, throw out when you get to the Israeli army.
What's more difficult, being interviewed on CNN or going on the Stephen Colbert show?
Being in combat. Stephen Colbert is much harder. And I say this, much harder. No, it's true. It's the same game, because it's a game when you're interviewed. The interviewer has a teleprompter, has all the questions. The producers have provided the questions. You don't know what the questions are. And so you're improvising, and he or she isn't. With Colbert, it's worse, okay? Because you have no idea where he's coming from. And there's 2 rules of thumb. Besides the fact that I genuinely like that man. He's amazing. One is never try to be funny. Let him to be funny. Anybody who tries to be funny will get killed. And 2, come prepared with 3 messages. If you get 2 across, it's great. If you get 1 across, it's okay. You've succeeded. And I think I succeeded every time in getting this across. Mm-hmm. But near misses, I'm telling you, near misses.
AJ, I wanted to see if you had any more questions for Michael before we start to wrap things up.
Well, I thought maybe I could bring it back to writing a little and try to bridge the 2 topics, because it seems to me fiction writing especially, you really have to get inside someone else's minds, and maybe that's a really great way to build compassion and build perspective taking. So do you find that helps you in being a historian, a politician, an ambassador, or are they 2 totally different skills?
No, they overlap. Where do they overlap? Sometimes, I write historical fiction, and I use my historian skills to research them. There are stories in the Night Archer about the 14th century, and there's stories about the 15th century. In this new novel, Fourth Cliff, I had to research what people wore in 1944, the way they spoke in 1944, what they ate, what the inside of a Mercury coupe looked like, okay? And how you operated a 1940 Harley Davidson, really. And you can find all this on the internet days. That's the great part. They overlap in the best compliment I ever get about my history is that my history books read like novels. I love that. You can say that to me all the time, and you've won me over. And though I also choose topics that are highly dramatic, like the 6-Day War. I mean, you got to work really hard to make the 6-Day War dull, right? Really. And then in diplomacy, listen, what is diplomacy? It's understanding human nature. It's sitting across from an official from a foreign government and understanding what she's saying. And it's not necessarily what she's saying. You know, there's a balloon over her head, or you know, there's subtitles above it. As my mother, the 93-year-old retired family therapist, always says, the presenting problem is not the problem. And so it helps to be sensitized to what the real problem is, what someone's really saying. And I think there I'm drawing on my skills as a novelist.
Love it. Well, yes, Suzanne, I know that we have a strict deadline, a hard out, so I'll let you wrap it up. But I just want to say thank you, Michael, for taking the time. I loved hearing your thoughts. And again, I am green with envy about your productivity. I'm gonna start. What was it again? What were the secrets? That you're very disciplined. You wake up early. I'm going to start waking up more earlier. Working out. Should I start working out? Is that
working? Yes, it's crucial. It's crucial for it.
All right. You're gonna help me finish my book.
Go for it. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm honored and delighted.
Just as we wrap up, just tell us what's next for you. Getting back into politics, more books. What can we expect?
Well, I have completed now about half of my next collection of short stories. I do have this fourth Cliff book coming out hopefully next year. If anybody's in the audience wants to publish a really great book that will make an Oscar-winning movie, let me know. I will continue hopefully to make a living by consulting. But what I say this, you know, if I'm called to the flag, I'm always going to go to the flag. You know, it's a Cincinnatus thing, and I've been called to the flag repeatedly throughout my career. And it would be difficult, especially now with the grandchildren, really difficult. So it depends, you know, how I'm called, where I'm called. I cannot say no.
Okay. Well, and on that note, we thank both of you so much, AJ and Michael, for joining us. And thank you to the audience for watching. We invite everybody to go out and purchase To All Who Call in Truth. We look forward to your next book, and remind everybody to go to momentmag.com for next week's Zoominar with Congressman Dan Glickman and his son, Hollywood producer John Glickman. Again, thank you, everybody, and we will see you next time.
Bye. Shalom, shalom. Bye.